Harold Adrian Russell Philby was born on January 1, 1912, in Ambala, India, at the edge of the British Empire. His father, St. John Philby, was an explorer, diplomat, and Arabist, a man who moved between worlds and languages with ease. This cosmopolitan environment shaped Kim from childhood. He grew up between two realities: the colonial confidence of the British Empire and the complexity of the wider world that it ruled. From early on, he learned that loyalty was often a matter of perspective. Educated first at Westminster School and later at Trinity College, Cambridge, Philby absorbed the manners and confidence of Britain's elite. But the world around him was changing. The Great Depression, the rise of fascism, and the spread of Marxist thought in Europe gave birth to a generation that doubted the moral legitimacy of its own empire. Cambridge in the 1930s was a place of debate and rebellion. In its libraries and secret societies, young men discussed the failures of capitalism and the promise of a new order. Among them were Guy Burgess, Donald Maclean, Anthony Blunt, John Cairncross, and Kim Philby. At a 1.0x, Philby's path toward betrayal did not begin with money or coercion, but with conviction. He was drawn to the Soviet experiment not as a foreign project, but as a possible moral correction to the chaos of the West. When he met Arnold Deutsch, a Czechoslovakian communist working undercover in London, he was offered a purpose. Deutsch recognized in Philby an unusual mixture: an upper-class background that could open doors and a genuine ideological belief that could survive pressure. Around 1934, Philby agreed to work for the Soviet Union. His code name would later become Sonny, and his mission was simple: to penetrate the heart of British intelligence. At first, Philby worked as a journalist. He covered the Spanish Civil War from the nationalist side, posing as a supporter of General Franco. The choice was strategic. By pretending to sympathize with the far right, he distanced himself from suspicion of communist ties. The reports he sent back to London earned him a reputation for courage and discretion. What few knew was that behind those lines, he was also sending reports to Moscow, describing German and Italian involvement in Spain, and mapping the emerging structure of fascist cooperation. By the late 1930s, as Europe moved toward war, Philby had already begun to build the foundations of one of the most effective infiltration operations in history. When World War II broke out, Britain needed new officers for its intelligence services. Men of good education and patriotic image were in high demand. Philby fit perfectly. In 1940, he was recruited into the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6. From that moment, the Soviet Union had a direct line into the very core of Britain's espionage network. Within a few years, Philby's influence expanded. He was assigned to the section responsible for counterintelligence against the Soviet Union. Ironically, he was now in charge of tracking and exposing the very organization he served. Every time MI6 came close to identifying a Soviet agent, Philby quietly intervened. He warned Moscow about ongoing investigations, protected exposed contacts, and redirected British attention toward false targets. The damage was incalculable. When the war ended in 1945, Philby's reputation was impeccable. He had been decorated by the British government, trusted by colleagues, and admired by American allies. He was promoted to head of Section 9, the Soviet counter-espionage division of MI6. It was the perfect position for a double agent. Through him, the Soviet Union learned about Allied operations, agent networks in Eastern Europe, and Western understanding of Soviet strategy. Every secret plan, every intercepted message, every coded instruction that crossed his desk could be copied and sent to Moscow within hours. Yet even at the height of his deception, Philby remained calm and composed. He was known for his dry humor, his love of cricket, and his impeccable manners. Colleagues described him as charming and loyal. He drank heavily, but that too was part of the culture, not a sign of guilt. Behind this calm mask, however, the flow of secrets continued. His reports helped the Soviets identify double agents inside their own ranks and anticipate British moves during the early Cold War. In 1949, Philby was sent to Washington as the chief British liaison officer between MI6 and the newly formed CIA. It was a position of immense strategic importance. At that time, the United States and Britain shared nearly every aspect of intelligence cooperation. Through Philby, Moscow now had insight into the most sensitive joint operations, from Berlin to the Middle East. He was in direct contact with senior American officials, including James Angleton, the man who would later become obsessed with finding Soviet moles inside the CIA. Philby's influence in Washington could not be overstated. He attended briefings on covert actions, reviewed reports from the field, and participated in strategic planning for the containment of communism. Every week, information from those meetings reached Soviet hands. The consequences were deadly. Several American and British networks operating behind the Iron Curtain were dismantled soon after they began. Dozens of agents disappeared, arrested, tortured, or executed. When some within MI6 began to notice patterns, operations failing without clear explanation, leaks that could not be traced, suspicion grew. But the idea that Kim Philby, the well-spoken son of a British diplomat, could be a Soviet spy seemed absurd. He was one of them, a product of the same schools, the same clubs, the same unquestioned hierarchy. In the British establishment, background often mattered more than evidence. That social armor protected him longer than logic should have allowed. Still, the walls were slowly closing in. In 1951, two of his closest friends, Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean, suddenly defected to the Soviet Union. Both had been part of the same Cambridge circle. Their escape shocked the British government. Almost immediately, attention turned to those who had known them best. Philby was the obvious connection. His Washington posting was terminated. He was recalled to London for questioning. For the first time, the mask began to crack. Investigators found coincidences that were difficult to dismiss. His denials were calm but mechanical. Officially, no charges were brought, and the case was closed for lack of evidence. But his reputation was damaged. The CIA cut ties, and Philby was quietly pushed out of MI6 in 1951. For the next several years, he lived in a kind of professional exile, working as a journalist again, this time for British newspapers covering the Middle East. Unbeknownst to most, he was still in contact with Soviet handlers. His faith in communism had weakened, replaced by a sense of fatalism. Yet he continued to serve Moscow, partly out of conviction, partly out of habit. When the Cold War deepened and Western intelligence services reorganized, Moscow's center decided that Philby remained valuable. In 1956, he was reinstated as a covert agent under journalistic cover in Beirut. In Beirut, Philby rebuilt his life. To the world, he was a correspondent for The Observer and The Economist, covering political turmoil in the Middle East. He drank heavily, charmed diplomats, and maintained the same air of quiet intelligence that had protected him for decades. Yet beneath that facade, he was still transmitting reports to the Soviet Union. Using coded language and secret meetings, he provided information about Western networks and regional strategies, though his access was now more limited than before. By the late 1950s, British intelligence had not forgotten him. His name remained a shadow over every inquiry into past leaks. In 1961, a Soviet defector named Anatoly Golitsyn fled to the West and brought with him a series of explosive claims. Among them was a warning that a high-ranking British official, once stationed in Washington, had been working for Moscow. For MI6, the description matched only one man, Kim Philby. A quiet reinvestigation began. This time, the British could no longer afford to ignore the evidence. Files were reopened, patterns re-examined, and witnesses re-interviewed. The accumulation of facts pointed increasingly to Philby's guilt. But bringing formal charges required direct proof, and Philby was a master of leaving no trace. His charm and apparent cooperation confused his interrogators. In early 1963, MI6 sent Nicholas Elliott, one of Philby's oldest friends and colleagues, to confront him in Beirut. Elliott had once defended him during the first investigation and still hoped there was some mistake. Their meeting was calm, almost courteous. Elliott asked directly whether Philby had ever worked for the Soviets. For a moment, Philby hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I suppose, old boy," he said, "there's no point denying it now." Within days, the information reached London. MI6 prepared to bring him home quietly under escort, hoping to extract a full confession before the press learned the truth. But Moscow had other plans. Soviet handlers arranged a rapid extraction. One evening in January 1963, Philby simply vanished. He was last seen boarding a Soviet freighter at the port of Beirut. Weeks later, he surfaced in Moscow, welcomed not as a defector but as a hero. For Britain, it was a humiliation. For the Soviet Union, a triumph. And for the Western intelligence community, a lesson written in betrayal. Philby's escape destroyed the last illusions about loyalty within the upper class of British intelligence. The age of gentlemen spies was over. In Moscow, Philby was given an apartment, a pension, and the title of colonel in the KGB. Yet life in the workers' paradise was not what he had imagined. He struggled with isolation and alcoholism. The city that had once been a symbol of his ideals became a cage of bureaucratic control. His Soviet comrades admired his service, but never fully trusted him. They knew he had spent most of his life among their enemies, and feared he might still harbor doubts. He remarried several times, and occasionally appeared at official receptions, but his health and spirit declined. In private moments, he admitted to friends that he felt forgotten by the world he had tried to change. He had betrayed his country for an ideal that no longer existed. The Soviet system he had believed in had become the same kind of oppressive hierarchy he once despised. Still, his legacy was enormous. The information he passed to Moscow over nearly 3 decades reshaped global intelligence. Through him, the Soviets learned about Allied counter-espionage operations, NATO's early strategies, and Western plans in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. His reports compromised hundreds of operations, led to the deaths of agents, and forced both MI6 and the CIA to rebuild their internal security from the ground up. James Jesus Angleton, his American counterpart and close friend during the Washington years, never recovered from the betrayal. For the rest of his career, Angleton saw Soviet moles everywhere, dismantling networks and careers in a paranoid search for another Philby. Within MI6, the same paranoia took root. The sense of quiet fraternity that had once defined British intelligence vanished forever. Philby's own justifications changed over time. To some visitors in Moscow, he spoke of history and ideology, the need to balance power, to prevent another fascist war, to protect what he believed was a fairer future. To others, he admitted it was more personal. He said he could not bear the hypocrisy of his own class, that he preferred to betray a government than betray what he saw as truth. Whether these explanations were sincere or self-defense will never be known. In 1988, Kim Philby died in Moscow at the age of 76. The Soviet Union gave him a state funeral. His coffin was draped in red, and he was buried with full honors at Kuntsevo Cemetery, near other heroes of the KGB. A simple inscription marked the grave of the man who had fooled 2 of the most powerful intelligence services in the world. After the fall of the USSR, archives confirmed the extent of his espionage. His reports filled volumes. Many operations that Western agencies considered routine failures were in fact destroyed from within. Even decades later, the number of lives lost because of his leaks remains uncertain. Historians estimate that his information directly led to the exposure of dozens of Western agents in Eastern Europe and the Middle East during the late 1940s and early 1950s. In retrospect, Philby's betrayal was not just an act of espionage, it was a cultural earthquake. It forced Britain and America to abandon the notion that background equaled loyalty. It exposed the vulnerability of trust within elite institutions built on shared privilege rather than accountability. It also changed the nature of counterintelligence itself, from a social club of gentlemen into a professional discipline defined by suspicion and verification. For the Soviet Union, Philby became a symbol of Western decay, proof that even the heart of capitalism could be turned. Soviet propaganda portrayed him as the man who fooled the world, a brilliant spy driven by conscience. For the West, he was a reminder that the most dangerous traitors are not the ones who hate their country, but those who seem to love it too much to question themselves. In the end, Philby's story is not only about betrayal, but also about belief. It shows how conviction can become blindness and how ideals can justify the unimaginable. He believed he was on the right side of history, and for that belief, he destroyed everything else: his friendships, his country, and ultimately himself. Today, more than 60 years later, the name Kim Philby still stands as a synonym for treason. His file remains one of the most studied cases in intelligence history, dissected by every generation of spies that came after. The irony is that the man who sought to serve a cause greater than himself ended up serving no one at all. As one former colleague later wrote, Philby did not just betray a nation, he betrayed the idea that truth can survive secrecy. And that, perhaps, is why his story continues to fascinate. Because behind the code names and the politics, it is a story of a single human flaw repeated on a global scale: the belief that one man can decide who deserves to know the truth.